Welcome to Keyfest 2021, presented by Casa, the best in Bitcoin security. My name is Nick Newman, and I'm the CEO at Casa, and I'm excited to welcome you to a few days of discussions and workshops where we're going to teach you about the power of private keys, both in Bitcoin and beyond. In 2020, Bitcoin hit all-time highs. Institutional adoption has swelled to levels we've never seen before. And amidst a global pandemic, the Bitcoin community has grown substantially. At Casa, we believe that private keys are a fundamental building block of Bitcoin that all new Bitcoiners should understand. We created Keyfest as a fun and educational way to spread that knowledge. Keys are the foundation of everything we do in Bitcoin, and they're inherently very personal. At Casa, we're building a personal key manager that allows you to take control of your financial life. Your private keys allow you, and only you, to have direct ownership of your money through Bitcoin. At Casa, we help you secure these keys so you can live your life with the peace of mind that your Bitcoin is secure. Let's kick off day one of Keyfest. We'll first dive into the beginnings of the Cypherpunk movement and discuss how that's evolved into Bitcoin development today. To teach us about this, we have Casa CTO Jameson Lopp, Blockstream co-founder and CEO Adam Back, and Bitcoin core developer Amiti Uttarwar.
So let's get started with just some quick intros here. Adam, you have been in the Bitcoin and Cypherpunk space for a while. I guess, how would you describe, how you got to where you are today?
I think that the internet itself, when it was first becoming more widely used, originally in kind of universities and things like that, it had a sort of a new social dynamic. It gave people more voice, more control, and governments were initially alarmed that people could write blog posts, they could organize, they could communicate anonymously and privately, potentially. And so the advent of public key cryptography and that becoming available in a way accessible, in software packages accessible to end users, like with PGP and easy to use variants. Encrypted voice communications were harder back then. Like smartphones weren't very smart. It was challenging to get access to the microphone and speaker in software. That's all changed over the years. And so I think the cypherpunks were a group of people who thought that this was very interesting, but the internet was very logged, very transparent, and that people would basically lose de facto rights that they had legally and in person kind of conversations, freedom of association, privacy, that kind of thing, would tend to get lost online. And so rather than lobby regulators and governments and lawmakers about how their rights should be preserved, they just set about building tools to assert their rights. And that's where PGP came from, and things like Tor and anonymous remailers, which are a way to communicate with some privacy, at least via email, Tor via browsing. And that same kind of group of people were interested in anything that provided privacy. And obviously electronic cash was a very important missing part of that. And so that sort of, there was in the mid-90s, there was DigiCash, which actually John, he invented a cryptographic protocol, and that had extremely strong privacy, but was a bit centralized. So ultimately, for various business reasons, that company failed and was a kind of single point of failure, at least in terms of its need to ask permission from a bank, because it didn't have any mining. It was a kind of equivalent of a stablecoin, we'd call it today, but with strong privacy. And so, the permission from the bank, single point of failure, central point of failure, the database kind of disappeared. So anybody who had coins couldn't even prove they were hard anymore. So I think that experience informed a lot of thinking about electronic cash. And so the things that came after it, or the proposals, many of which were not actually implemented, but you could see the motivation for B-Money and BitGold, which used Hashcash to, which proposed using Hashcash for mining, and Halfini proposed something called RPow later. So anyway, I think the overall viewpoint was, maybe a bit irreverent. Like, Cypherpunk don't care. If you like what we're doing, we're going to assert our rights, and if you don't like that, well, that's your problem, kind of thing. So basically trying to assert balance by being an agent for your own rights. Just assert your rights. And if people want to erode your rights, at least make them fight for it, right?
Yeah, if you don't like it, you write code that does what you want it to do, and no one can stop the code if you write it correctly. But Amiti, you're a much newer entrant to this space. I think you've approached this from less of a cypherpunk angle and more of a just fresh software engineer who's looking for interesting projects. What is your path that you took to end up becoming a full-time Bitcoin developer?
Yeah, I guess when I first learned about Bitcoin, what really captivated my attention is the introduction of this new trust model. Historically, the two dominant trust models we have are either direct, where I get to know you and we can make trades, we can trust one another, have future promises, do business, or hierarchical, where that can extend. If I have direct trust, that can extend outwards. And this hierarchical model is really what has allowed our society to grow to the scale that we're currently at, whether it's banks and the way finances work, or organizational systems like schools and businesses, because the direct model only scales so far. And when I learned about Bitcoin, the idea of there's this technology that we can use where you actually don't need to trust somebody else. You can have transactions, you can make deals, you can keep a ledger with people you don't know or you don't trust. And the potential for what that means in our global society, of how that could distribute wealth in potentially a more fair way, or getting to the people who are actually providing the services. Or even if we go further than that, what that would mean in the long term really just compelled me. It captured my interest, and it made me want to learn all about it and just get closer and closer, deeper and deeper. And one step at a time. I mean, it took me some time, a lot of hard work, and a ton of luck. But
that's the rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's the rabbit hole. And here I am, and I still feel like I've got a long way to go.
Well, Adam, you mentioned a few of the failed digital cash projects over the years. Bitcoin was by no means the first thing that came out of this movement. How much attention were you paying to those early projects? Do you even remember how many there were? We hear of 2 or 3. I feel like there were probably many more that never even got to the code stage. It was more theoretical. But was this something that you were highly attuned to, or had you pretty much written them off after a while? I know that you are well known for creating Hashcash, but that was less of a digital cash project and more of an anti-spam project, right?
Right. So, I mean, there were certainly many some like startups that kind of faded, things like Flues and Beans. I'm not even sure how to categorize those things, kind of loyalty points that they try to bootstrap by giving away or something. So they didn't really go anywhere. And the DigiCash approach was basically stable coins, right? So you pay euros or some currency into it, it would sit in a bank account, you could use it in electronic cash format, and then you could redeem it afterwards. And that was centralized. I mean, in terms of the level of interest, I think DigiCash and the idea of being able to build a bearer electronic cash captured a lot of people's imagination. So there's a similar kind of energy to Bitcoin, but on a much smaller scale because it didn't get deployed that far. Another system which appealed to a lot of people was eGold, which was based on physical gold storage. it actually had, quite a lot of money under management and a fairly decent kind of transactional volume per year, considering that it was, it's just basically a website and email integration and things like that. And then the things that came out of the failure of the centralized systems, namely bmoney, BitGold, RPow, and later, we can assume, we don't really know, I guess nobody really knows if Satoshi, reinvented those things. It seems like it, it seems like he wasn't aware of BitGold and bmoney. But that, the idea to use proof of work to mine coins seemed attractive to people and actually to occur to many people independently. So in the context that people were just recently kind of dismayed that DigiCash kind of went under and didn't get bootstrapped, and according to some kind of informal reports of people who knew people at the company, there was some regulator pressure about running even a demo server. So, I think informed by that, as soon as Hashcash was released, initially for the kind of anti-spam for remailers, actually, because it's challenging to, usually people control spam by blocking IP addresses or email addresses. Well, you can't do that.
Reputation.
Yeah, so that kind of caused the reset, which is like looking at it from a point of view of cost rather than identity, because they're anonymous by design, right? So, but immediately that was published, like, conversations within the next few days and onwards were observing that this is an interesting construct, some kind of digital gold, and there's a lot of brainstorming about how could you sort of control inflation. It's sort of everywhere in the dark, trying to figure out would this thing hyperinflate at the rate of Moore's law? Kind of, just thoughts like that, and thinking about, well, could you have, I think Ryan Lackey proposed kind of bandwidth futures, or just anything to hedge it or control it running away. So yeah. I think, a lot of people don't, it's always easy to look at things in hindsight, but at the time it seemed to me that the missing aspect was how to control inflation of the supply, and bmoney and BitGold had some systems to do that, but they were a bit more federated, like controlled by a group of humans or servers. Nick Szabo's case, some markets that would assemble. So in Nick Szabo's model in BitGold, individuals would mine as many coins as they want, and then after the fact, if there are a lot of coins mined in a period, you would consider them cheap. They would not be rare. And the assumption is that rare stamps are worth more. So when there are few coins mined in a month, those are rarer, and then you'd assemble them into standardized value bundles, and that would be a coin. So it's kind of market.
Would you say you found the 1,000 ways that didn't work over the first few decades? You were finding that there were incentive problems, there were technical weaknesses, regulatory weaknesses, and really it was Satoshi managed to combine a bunch of technologies that already generally existed, but had never really fit the pieces of the puzzle together in that way before. I think. That was what was a major innovation.
Yeah, I mean, it's using the proof of work for multiple things. So it's sort of interesting, right? That it's using it to emit new coins, which was something that seemed to occur readily to many people. That this might be a solution to the needing a banking interface. I mean, Wei Dai, in his preface to bmoney, had proposed bmoney as an electronic cash system without a banking interface as a solution to that. So people recognize that, but the decentralized coordination and the inflation, how to control that. So I think Bitcoin, as people will be aware, pretty much doesn't try to. It just controls the rate of supply. Then the price inflation is what it is, right? If there are more people buying, if people are buying them faster than the coins are being mined, the price will go up, and if it's less, the price will go down. So you get some kind of volatility and adoption cycle. that seems to do the trick, right? So
yeah,
if
the
you told
number
that to
go up
people,
technology has definitely worked in a variety of different aspects. I think it has, of course, brought in investors, but in general seems to be increasing mainstream awareness and adoption. I'm sure in no small part it resulted in Amiti at least hearing about Bitcoin and looking into it and figuring out, well, what is this thing? I mean, the same thing happened to me, and I think most other people, is something gets into the news. It's usually spurred by price movements, but then, especially those of us who are more technical, we start looking under the hood. And if you have a computer science background, it shouldn't take you long to figure out that this is solving some very interesting problems in an elegant way that from initial glance doesn't make a lot of sense, but once you really start digging into it, it's a pretty interesting innovation. So Amiti, you said you didn't come in from a cypherpunk angle, but you are full-time contributing to what you consider to be a very interesting new trust model, a new way of organizing and sharing data and creating economic interactions. You were obviously interacting with a lot of other people like yourself who are in this new generation of developers working on this new type of technology. What do you see, or do you see any sort of shared attributes or ethos, possibly non-cypherpunk stuff, but perhaps some sort of new perspective on the world and on this technology? There is a common, I think, theme or issue when people try to talk about, what is Bitcoin and what is Bitcoin development and who controls it and all of that. It's very hard to define because there is no authority that defines it. But do you see some sort of new set of ideals or perspectives in your peer group that you're interacting with regularly? What is your shared motivation? What do you? Obviously, you can't speak for everyone. You can only speak for yourself. But just from your own perspective.
Yeah, I guess I think what's interesting is that there is more diverse perspectives. There are some people who have come in because of finding value with cypherpunk ideals, even still, like my mentee Gloria Zhao, who just graduated from Berkeley and is now a full-time contributor on Bitcoin. The cypherpunk ideals really resonated with her and led her to working on Bitcoin. Whereas, as I've mentioned, that wasn't what initially drew me in. That was something I learned about later. But I think that is kind of cool because having more diverse perspectives really contributes a more holistic view of Bitcoin, where I don't actually see any huge themes because the project development has gotten to the place where different people see different versions of Bitcoin, and that's what draws them in closer. And even at a technical level, as we move more towards like modular components or different aspects of the code base are what we focus on. Like, for example, I focus on peer-to-peer, and I'm very unfamiliar with like the latest developments on the wallet side. But I think that's a really good sign for the advancement of the project as a whole, because that means that we're able to tease it apart and have people specialize in each of these intricate, nuanced areas. And that's the direction we'd like to move as well. Of course, keeping like a holistic approach is really important. And I think that like we can look at it from a technical level similarly of teasing apart what your specialty is. But we can also look at it at more of that human aspect of what is important about Bitcoin to you, or what does Bitcoin mean to you. And I think earlier there was more like homogenous views of what is Bitcoin and who are the people, what are the shared beliefs that lead people to working on Bitcoin. But as we see more adoption, as we see more people like play out different use cases for how Bitcoin could be in the world, we see a wider range of perspectives of like what draws you in, you know? So even if the cypherpunk ideals weren't what drew me in, I think there's a lot of shared principles because what fundamentally to me makes Bitcoin different is that it's inclusive by design. Like I work really hard on the P2P node level to make sure that no entity can prevent another entity from participating in the system. And to have that be a first principle of the system, of a financial system, of a digital financial system, is something that we haven't seen. All banks and fiat currencies in this day and age are like, well, depending on what government I am, I want to see your proof of address, or I want to, decide that your transactions are too sketchy, so I'm just going to say no without telling you. And it's a very exclusive idea of money. And Bitcoin is the exact opposite, where when I'm reviewing a PR, I'm like, oh, but this is how somebody could suppress a mempool transaction, or trying to think of those edge cases. So I think that those ideals do still stand strong, but the way that people interact with it is now more multifaceted, just because it's a larger group of people that are coming in versus like the original group of people who are developing the vision, you know?
Yeah. The ecosystem is definitely growing. I think that actually leads us quite well into the next topic, which is just the diversity of perspectives and things that people are working on. So, Amiti, you're very deep in the code of the networking protocols. Myself, my journey has changed over the years. I was generally a back-end infrastructure developer, not really doing protocol level work. And now I'm more high level, trying to manage a whole company that's focused on security. Adam is also focused on managing a company that's doing a variety of different projects across the entire space. What are your own perspectives of this diversity of different ways that people are working in public on Bitcoin? Maybe you're contributing to the mailing lists, maybe you're contributing to open source GitHub projects, maybe you're just posting on Bitcoin Twitter to get more clout. Who knows? It's up to each individual as to how they want to contribute to this space, and it doesn't have to be technical by any means. But what do you think has helped involvement in general here? Perhaps things like developer grants. Like, have we figured out the incentives for getting more people to contribute to open source and the technical side of things? Do you have any issues, or do you think venture capital and funding like that is the right incentives for certain things? This is, like we said, it's a very diverse space, and sometimes that causes clashes. There's certainly no shortage of drama, on Bitcoin Twitter, for example. And I know that, like Amiti in general, I think you have talked about some of the drama, things that can come up that, cause friction and perhaps even, cause you to be disheartened for short periods of time. But, what is it like, from your perspective, to be working in this kind of chaotic space? Either one of you. It's
interesting, that's for sure. It's also very hard to communicate.
Yeah.
But I think it's very rich, and it's important to have like these diversity of perspectives, even if I don't always agree with all of them. I think that having like healthy tensions is important and helps the project grow on many levels. Like on the technical level on GitHub, I love the culture of Bitcoin Core. I think it's extremely meritocratic, discourse-oriented. People are very communicative and explain their reasons. They're not shy to say, no, I think this is a bad idea. Or, obviously on the flip, yes, I think this is a great idea. We see plenty of both, but it's followed with justifications and explanation, whether it's a yes or a no of why. And I think that creates a very rich culture in which I've found it to be very welcoming and has demanded my growth and exposed me to a way to learn so much from other people. Obviously, Twitter is a little bit different. People love to say very strong opinions with no real explanation of why, and that's kind of the behavior that Twitter promotes. But at the same time, I think that even if I take offense to some things, I think on the whole, the Bitcoin community that I've met and that I see online is extremely strong. There's a lot of people who believe in it for their own reasons, and while some are more aggressive and others are more kind and welcoming and promote skepticism, which is a way that I identify with, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is money, and money only works if people buy into it. And so we need people trying different things and sending different messages in order to spread the kind of the gospel, to spread the ideas out. And whether it's different funding models, I think for developers or people who are working on it, I think it's really cool to see all of the experiments that have, in the past year, we've seen a lot of new players support Bitcoin core development and related protocol development. And we see them show up in so many different models. And I think that's really cool because this is an experiment in decentralized decision-making in more ways than one. There is the protocol level of here's a proof of work, here's a blockchain, here's a P2P protocol. We all together, we call that Bitcoin. But we also have other elements of it, like how does that change? How do decisions get made? How do we decide who works on it? How do we market it? How do we share these stories? All sorts of how does education work? And it's a really rich ecosystem, and there are so many projects, and I think that's very, very important and exciting because it still feels like we're very early. And so I love seeing all the different experiments. And I'm very curious to see over our lifetimes what will play out.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
Adam, I know you mentioned, I think you mentioned PGP in your introduction, one of the early consumer products for, normal folks to be able to use private keys to, encrypt their communications. Over the decades, does it seem like we've made significant progress with getting people to manage private keys and be able to actually make use of them? It seems like we still have a long ways to go on the user experience side on just key management in general. What are your thoughts? And obviously this plays into Blockstream just announcing their recent key management hardware that should be coming out soon. So obviously you still think there are things that need to be done on that front. What do you think we need to work on to make this technology understood and usable by mainstream audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that users should have control of their keys. So things like ETFs and Bitcoin tracker funds are convenient for integrating with a brokerage or something like that, right? You can mix Bitcoin into the margin in a portfolio that way. Whereas if you have the keys, it's invisible to the system. So I think that it's important that users have some direct control because things can come off the rails during forks, for example. So, Bitcoin is not a democracy. It's better than a democracy, which is that you can unilaterally assert your rights. Now, if you have some very fringe rights or very, very fringe views, you might end up on a chain with very few people on it. But, generally speaking, the default outcome of consensus decision-making, which is completely distinct from the, blockchain kind of tiebreaker proof of work form of consensus, but just the consensus decision making around protocols is that if people don't agree, then nothing changes, the status quo persists. And so I think that people, a lot of people learned things from the fork discussion a few years ago. I think the most breathtaking thing is that the market asserted its viewpoint, and that was a very good thing. And so some special interests lost heavily, and the market rejected those proposals. But it was untidy. So I think the next time that will be tidier, because people learn things and markets don't like unpredictability. But
keys definitely give you power, don't they? It's more about just being able to secure your money, but also being able to help reinforce what you believe the money should be.
Right. And so I think that led a lot of people to say, okay, well, what lessons should I draw from that? Well, one is, if I have my own keys and I run my own full node, then I decide what protocol version defines money for me. And so I think that's true, right? If you put your Bitcoins with a custodian, maybe the fund manager at the custodian has a different view to you, or a view that doesn't suit you. And you can react to that, you can switch funds to a different manager. But as long as a decent proportion of power users and investors realize this causal link and assert control of their keys, it provides a break, a sort of friction that prevents changes that are against the user's interests, I would say. And the other thing is that, I think Casa and Blockstream Green and some other things which, other systems which involve multi-sig are able to do more than just say, well, you're going to hold your life savings in cash form, which is a little bit like, storing gold bars in a home safe. It could get dangerous if it's a lot of money, right? So it's not generally advisable. You might fail at IT backup, but the realization is that with multi-signatures and smart contracts and time locks, that actually you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, right? You can have the usual bank-like two-factor authentication and failure and recovery. If you mess up, you can re-enroll and regain access to your funds. But if and until you do have that IT failure, you are able to control your keys. So the experience might be kind of like two-factor authentication to log onto a banking site, but actually it's not just authentication. Those funds can't move without your approval. So I think the experience can be made to match that. And in my view, it would be very good if custody solutions evolved in that direction, including things with, actual custodian flavor or ETF flavor, had an option for users to have a multi-sig expires if they mess up, and then they can recover it that way.
Obviously still a lot of room for improvement here. There's a reason why the banking system exists. There are certain safeguards that it provides. It's trade-offs, but there's no reason to believe that we can't figure out how to engineer a lot of those safeguards on top of this new system. So with this system continuing to grow, we need to keep bringing more talent into the space to help accelerate that development, improve the security, improve the user experience. Amiti, I know you're an advocate of education. Where do you think we go from here on that front? How are you trying to use your resources, your own experience to help bring in the next generation of developers?
Yeah. So in terms of education, I would agree. Like for the general population, understanding what private keys are and what your options are in terms of keeping them safe, both from others as well as from yourself, is extremely crucial. And then in terms of Bitcoin developers, it's still a very, very small community of people who are working on Bitcoin Core specifically. And I try to help people find on-ramps, because if without the people who have mentored me and helped onboard me, there's no chance I would have been here. And so trying to aid other people in identifying how they can serve the project and how do you learn and as well as offer utility is something that I find both difficult as well as crucial, especially when you're newer. And that's very, very fundamentally different than most like companies or organizations. For example, most jobs you get, you apply for the job, you interview, you get the role based on your potential, and then you show up and you go, okay, what do I do now? I will learn it and I will do it. But in Bitcoin, that's not at all how it works. You just have to kind of like show up and lurk and be like, all right, well, seems like there's a lot of really hard problems around. How do I find something that's useful and small enough and contained that I can take it off and, spend 10 times as long as it would for somebody familiar, but actually come out with something and offer this as value to the project? It's really not an easy question to answer, especially when you're not familiar with the overall project and the direction and the pulse of what more established contributors find has utility. And so I think in that way, where we're at right now in Bitcoin, having more direct like mentorship or direct relations is important, as well as developing resources that people can utilize off of the repo so that it's not a cost to the maintainers or the established contributors who are furthering their goals, but people who are interested can, take in these resources and tinker with them, spend their time learning with them, and then come to the repo more equipped. So that's something that I do when a lot of people have approached me and expressed interest of, hey, I want to contribute to Bitcoin Core. What do I do? So I've written up a blog post with a bunch of my learnings and understandings, but the main thing I tell them is I give them a small exercise that is in the functional tests. And it's something along the lines of, spin up 2 nodes and have one node send a block or a transaction to the other one and check that it's been received. And this is something they can do entirely on their own. There's no GitHub activity, so there's no cost of to the maintainers. And that's a way that they can get their feet wet and tinker with RPC calls and the functional tests. And after that, they feel more familiar and might be ready to like review a PR in the functional tests. So over time, I hope to see like a lot more educational material develop. I think Chain Code Labs is and their residency program, as well as a lot of material they've posted online. Jameson, I know you have a fantastic, exhaustive list of resources that
Got a few links.
just 1 or 2. But seeing more of these like technical educational resources develop, I think will help attract more people, because when I first started, I did not think I could contribute to Bitcoin Core. That just seemed impossible to me. But because of the guidance and the mentorship I had of like, here, just try this one thing. And now at this point, I'm able to help others as well. So I think we're still in a stage where it's a one-to-one and mentorship is really crucial, but over time, I hope to see it kind of expand out to one-to-N and have more people be able to like help themselves to get started.
Yeah. So on a bit of a tangent, though, definitely related to sort of evolution and future of Bitcoin, one quote that I keep thinking about on a fairly regular basis is actually made by Mark Andreessen in 2014, in which he predicted that, by his words, the fringe libertarian politics would get pushed out of Bitcoin as it went mainstream. I'm wondering, what do you think about how we ensure the integrity of the system that we have built as we continue to evolve it over the years and decades and hopefully generations. I think pretty much everyone who is building in these systems wants to build something that will outlast, any type of fiat currency that has ever existed. But, in order to do that, you need not only integrity, I think, from like the security and technical perspective, but also this integrity of ethos and the underpinnings of what the people are agreeing on in the first place. So wondering if either of you have ideas about, maintaining that, ideological integrity.
I mean, I think that some people throw around the words that blockchains have governance, but I think that's a misnomer. They really don't, or if they're at all meaningful, they don't. So I'd say Bitcoin has no governance, and by design, intentionally so, which is there are a set of kind of properties about Bitcoin that are going to be extremely hard to change. Like nobody's going to accept them. If you make changes, even to Bitcoin Core that propose them, people will just switch to a different software repository. And, once in a while, somebody will float an idea and, in a different project, and it will just get rejected outright. And, the obvious things are that Bitcoin should be permissionless, and the economics should be unchanged, the supply cap, the rate of coin emission, things like that, and that it should be an open network, basically. So I think that's one of the root causes of the internet being as wildly successful as it was as compared to previous closed networks, which is that permissionless networks, when people can innovate on them faster, and you can have like a healthy competition to add products and services and higher level protocols above a stable and dependable base. And Bitcoin obviously has the other factor, which is that it's storing money, and it's apart from transacting, people are placing a lot of reliance on it to function as a digital gold. And I was at some kind of hangout with a wide range of people interested or invested in Bitcoin or in Bitcoin technology, and the question was raised for the group, from the technologists towards the rest of the group, effectively, of the technical proposals being worked on at the moment, which ones are you most excited about as an investor or as a Bitcoin interested person, philosophically or financially? And basically the message from the investors was like, just don't break it, right? A bit of key management would be okay, but the rest of it, the main message was don't break it. So I think that pushes for predictability, eventual ossification or freezing of like the base protocol. I think TCP/IP, for example, doesn't wildly change, and people would be shocked if you suddenly, if your internet connection broke because somebody made a protocol revision, for example, right? So much of the world depends on that continuing to be reliable. But that doesn't, I think, and there are initiatives within the Bitcoin project that have been going on for some time to modularize different parts of like the consensus library. And actually the sidechain technology that Blockstream was actually founded to develop was born out of that kind of direction, which is I was interested to improve some privacy aspects of Bitcoin, privacy and fungibility. And so I proposed a number of protocol ideas. So that was my background, kind of applied cryptography. And it became apparent that it was challenging to put major changes into Bitcoin. So I thought, well, okay, how do we solve that problem instead, which is how do you modularize Bitcoin so that you can have sort of enclaves or layers with different risk profiles that people can opt into and move funds between, and that became the sidechain basically. So I think increased modularity and layering is the way, which means that the base can be hardened and made robust and secure and less frequently changing. Obviously, there's sort of maintenance and modernization, but I think if you actually look at changes in the base protocol, they're all of that flavor, right? They're optimization, they're win-win, they're quality assurance, performance improvements, stability improvements, sort of incremental in a way. There's an enormous amount of work going on as well, right? So some people in competing projects like to say things like, "Oh, Bitcoin stalled" or something, but I mean, there's actually completely inverted, right? The amount of engineering effort expended is really quite high and accelerating.
Absolutely.
So I'm a fan of layering, basically. I think that's the way.
Makes sense. So we're almost out of time. We'll try to get to one audience question, though. So the question is one that I get myself quite often. It's apart from running a node, what are some other ways that someone should look into starting to contribute to Bitcoin? We've touched on this a bit. Obviously there are many different ways. Any thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think what's really important is looking at your own interest and your community and your skill set and identifying, well, how do I further the value for not just myself, but the people around me? And that also keeps it engaging. Like if I can, learn something and then share that with others, whether it's a podcast or a technical contribution to Bitcoin Core, or like anything in between, I think that is how you get value and stay engaged. And there's just so many layers of work we have to do. And a lot of those are the human aspects of like education and sharing ideas. So even if like a lot of people ask me like, oh, but I'm not technical, how can I contribute? And I often say like, as a technical contributor, it's a better defined path. Like I want to make a PR on GitHub, but we need everything else in between. So looking at what your skill set is and looking at what your community is and how you can match that up with the parts of Bitcoin that interest you, I think is the best way to figure out how to contribute and the best way to feel good about it.
Absolutely. Do what you're good at, because that's how you will be able to, bring the most leverage and therefore the most benefit to the system as a whole. Well, I think that is about all the time that we've got, unfortunately. I'm sure we could talk about Bitcoin all day long, but we've got plenty of work to do.